bid hit $47 million before the auctioneer finished the sentence. 3 seconds later, it was $50 million. Then $58 million. The three men placing those bids had between them built 4 of the largest technology companies on the eastern seaboard. They were not men who moved without reason. They were not men who competed publicly unless the thing being competed over was worth every number on the board. The man they were bidding on stood at the edge of the room in a work jacket with a paint stain on the left sleeve, holding a child's crayon drawing. He had not looked at the board once. He was thinking about his daughter. Marcus Cole had not intended to be here. He had not filled out the summit application himself. The form had been completed by his neighbor, Dara Osei, a retired patent attorney who had spent 6 months watching Marcus carry blueprints between the garage and the apartment at hours that suggested a man who had stopped distinguishing between day and night. Dara had found the application on the summit's website at 11:40 on a Tuesday evening, printed it, slid it under Marcus's door with a note that said only, "You should." Marcus had found it the next morning under Ava's backpack, read it twice, and set it on the kitchen counter where it stayed for 9 days before he filled it out. He had not told anyone he submitted it. He had not told anyone he was accepted. He was 38 years old. He had grown up in the Kelmore district, the second of 3 sons of a man who repaired industrial equipment for a living, and believed that understanding how something worked was more important than being told what it was worth. His father had kept a shelf of disassembled motors in the garage, each one labeled in black marker with the date it stopped working and the date Marcus's father had diagnosed the problem. Marcus had learned to read those labels before he learned to read anything else. He had gone to Carver Technical College on a partial scholarship, studied mechanical and systems engineering, and graduated with a record that his professors described, in the careful language of people who do not want to oversell, as unusually precise. He had taken a position at Callaway Engineering Group at 24. He had been good at the work in the way that people are good at things they were built for, not effortfully, not with visible strain, but with the natural economy of someone doing exactly what their particular mind was designed to do. He had met Claire at Callaway. She was a structural engineer, 2 years his senior, with a habit of leaving her calculations on whatever surface was nearest when a better thought arrived. Napkins, the backs of meeting agendas, once the margin of a lease agreement that their landlord had not found amusing. She thought in shapes before she thought in numbers, which was the opposite of Marcus, and the combination had produced, between them, an approach to problems that neither could have arrived at alone. They had married when Marcus was 27. Ava had arrived when he was 31. Claire had been 4 months into the design that would become the blueprint when the diagnosis came. She had continued working on it for 6 weeks after, in the hours when she felt well enough, in a notebook she kept on her side of the bed. The notebook had 47 pages of notes, 12 pages of calculations, and 3 pages of drawings that were more intuition than engineering. Shapes that suggested direction without specifying destination. She had stopped working on it on a Thursday. She had died on a Sunday. Ava had been 3 years and 11 days old. Marcus had left Callaway 60 days later. He had not planned to leave. He had simply found, on the morning of the 61st day, that he could not make himself walk through the building's entrance, and had stood on the pavement outside it for 11 minutes before turning around. He had called his manager from the street and said he needed time. His manager had said to take what he needed. Marcus had gone home, put Ava in her stroller, and walked 14 blocks to a converted garage space in the Delmore Industrial District that he had looked at twice and never rented. He had signed the lease that afternoon. The garage was 800 square feet. It had a workbench along the north wall, a hydraulic lift in the center that Marcus used as a flat surface, and a window on the east side that let in light from 7 in the morning until noon. He had brought Claire's notebook on the first day and set it on the workbench and not opened it for 3 weeks. When he finally opened it, he had sat with it for 4 hours without touching anything else. Then he had begun. What Claire had been designing was a modular thermal compression system, a method of transferring and redistributing heat energy across mechanical structures in a way that existing systems addressed inefficiently, with significant energy loss at each conversion point. The applications were broad enough to be difficult to categorize simply: aerospace load management, industrial cooling architecture, next-generation battery thermal regulation. The design was not a product. It was a principle, A new way of thinking about a problem that the industry had been solving with the same basic approach for 30 years. Claire's notebook suggested the principle. Marcus had spent 4 years building the mathematics around it, testing the compression ratios, developing the material specifications, and translating 47 pages of a brilliant woman's intuition into one blueprint that could be read, assessed, and built. The blueprint was not pretty. It had been revised 31 times. The current version showed the revision history in the margins, each iteration dated in Marcus's handwriting, the earliest from 4 years ago and the most recent from 6 days ago, when he had corrected a thermal coefficient calculation that had been 0.3% off for 8 months before he found it. It was drawn on drafting paper that had been folded and unfolded enough times to show the crease lines clearly. It had a coffee ring on the upper left corner from a mug that Marcus had set down on it 14 months ago and moved 3 seconds too late. It looked exactly like what it was. A document produced in a garage by a man working alone, without institutional support, without a team, without anyone telling him the problem was worth solving. He had rolled it carefully that morning and placed it in the cardboard tube. Ava had handed him the tube at the door with both hands, the way children hand over things they understand are important. He had taken the train to the Callaway building, found the registration desk, received his badge, and walked onto the summit floor carrying 4 years of work in a cardboard tube, wearing the jacket he used in the garage because it was the only one he owned that still fit correctly, and the paint stain on the left sleeve was from a stress test model he had built in February that had not survived contact with the workbench. He had not noticed the stain until he was already on the train. He had decided it did not matter. He was not here to be looked at. He was here because Claire had started something and he had finished it and it deserved to be seen. The open innovation floor ran along the eastern side of the 34th floor, a long stretch of presentation tables arranged in 2 rows with enough space between them for attendees to move freely and enough light from the floor-to-ceiling windows to make everything look more deliberate than it was. Each table had a number, a placard, and a small wireless microphone. Marcus had been assigned table 14. He had arrived 20 minutes early, unrolled the blueprint on the table surface, and weighted the corners with the 4 small metal clips he had brought in his jacket pocket because he had learned, from 4 years of working on flat surfaces, that paper does not stay where you put it unless you give it a reason to. By 9:30 the floor was active. Presenters at the other tables were arranging prototypes, connecting laptops, positioning product samples with the focused attention of people who had rehearsed this moment. Table 7 had a working drone model. Table 11 had a display screen running a live software interface. Table 19 had 3 people in coordinated clothing and a printed banner. Marcus had a blueprint and 4 metal clips and a cup of coffee that had been hot when he collected it from the hospitality station and was now somewhere between warm and not. He did not mind. He had not come to compete with the drone or the banner. He had come because the blueprint needed to be in a room with people who could read it, and this was the room. The first attendees reached his table at 9:38. 2 men, both in their mid-30s, both wearing the particular kind of casual expensive that technology conferences produced in quantity. They looked at the blueprint for approximately 12 seconds. One of them asked if it was a heat exchanger. Marcus said it was a modular thermal compression system. The man nodded in the way people nod when they have decided the answer is outside their interest and are being polite about the exit. They moved to table 15. 3 more people stopped between 9:38 and 9:47. None of them stayed longer than 90 seconds. One asked for a business card. Marcus did not have business cards. She moved on. Diana Voss arrived on the floor at 9:44. She did not arrive the way most people arrived at things. She arrived the way a weather system arrives, preceded by a shift in the room's attention, a subtle reorientation of bodies toward her position, a collective awareness that the most important person in the space had changed location. She was 44 years old, and she had the particular posture of someone who had spent 20 years walking into rooms where people expected her to fail, and had learned to enter every room as though the question had already been settled. Paul Garrett, her lead engineer, followed 2 steps behind. Behind him, 2 members of her executive team maintained a distance that communicated both proximity and discretion. She worked the floor from the north end, moving with efficiency rather than urgency, pausing at tables for intervals that lasted between 45 seconds and 3 minutes depending on what she found there. She spent 2 minutes and 40 seconds at table 7. She spent 90 seconds at table 11. She asked one question at table 19 and did not wait for the complete answer before moving. She reached table 14 at 9:47. Marcus was in the middle of explaining the third-stage compression ratio to a woman from the Callaway University Engineering Department who had stopped and appeared to be genuinely reading the blueprint rather than performing interest in it. He did not stop when Diana arrived. He finished the explanation, answered the follow-up question the woman asked, and then looked up. Diana was looking at the blueprint with the focused assessment she brought to everything, which was thorough and fast and had a visible endpoint, the moment when the assessment completed and the decision registered in her expression. That moment arrived at the 8-second mark. Something closed in her face. Not dramatically. Just the small specific closing that happens when a person has categorized something and moved it to the part of their attention that handles things requiring no further consideration. She looked at Paul Garrett. He was already looking at the blueprint with a similar expression, arrived at faster because he had been watching her face rather than the page and had taken his reading from her. Then Diana looked at Marcus directly. She said, "Who developed this?" Marcus said, "I did." She said, "At what institution?" He said, "Independently." Something moved across her face that was not quite amusement and not quite dismissal but occupied the territory between them. She reached out and pulled the blueprint toward her by the upper right corner, the metal clip on that corner coming loose and falling to the table with a small sound. She studied it for another 6 seconds. Then she slid it back across the table with 2 fingers, the way someone returns something they never wanted to touch. "Garage engineering," she said. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. The innovation floor had the particular acoustic quality of a large room that was not quite full, where sound carried further than speakers intended and landed with more precision than they sometimes preferred. The woman from Callaway University had gone still. 2 presenters at the adjacent table had stopped their own conversation. Paul Garrett produced a sound through his nose that communicated amusement without requiring him to commit to it openly. Someone near the hospitality station, who had been listening with more attention than their posture suggested, laughed once and briefly. Marcus looked at Paul Garrett. Then he looked at Diana. She had already half-turned toward table 15. She was not waiting for a response because she had not asked a question. She had issued a verdict, and verdicts in her experience did not require the input of the person they concerned. Marcus replaced the metal clip on the upper right corner of the blueprint. He smoothed the page once with the flat of his hand. He rolled it carefully the way he always rolled it, from right to left with even pressure without rushing. He capped the tube. He picked it up. He did not correct her. He did not address the people who had heard. He did not arrange his face into anything that would give the room information about what he was feeling, because what he was feeling was not the room's business, and he had learned, in the specific education that grief provides, that not everything requires a response. He had taken 3 steps toward the exit when the man in the back row stood up. Dr. James Ito had arrived at the summit at 7:50 in the morning, which was 70 minutes before registration opened, and had waited in the building lobby reading a journal article on adaptive materials fatigue until the elevators became available. He was 61 years old. He had spent 34 years in systems engineering, the first 12 at a government aerospace research facility, the following 22 at Meridian Systems, where he currently held the title of Chief Technical Architect, which was the organization's way of acknowledging that his value to the company was not administrative and could not be adequately described by any title that implied management of people rather than problems. He had published 31 papers. He had been cited in 214 others. He held 9 patents, all of which he had filed because the ideas were worth protecting, not because the institution had asked him to. He attended approximately 4 conferences per year. He attended them for the same reason a person with good hearing attends a concert, not to be seen there, but because occasionally something worth listening to appeared. He had spent the first 2 hours of the summit at a corner table reviewing structural load documentation that had nothing to do with the summit's theme and everything to do with a problem his team had been working on for 11 months without arriving at a satisfying answer. He had a cup of tea that had gone cold. He had not replaced it. He had the particular quality of concentration that makes a person invisible in a public space, not through any deliberate effort, but simply because the depth of their attention creates a kind of gravity that pulls everything inward and leaves nothing to project outward. He had noticed Marcus Cole at 9:34. Not because Marcus had done anything to attract attention. He had not. He had been standing at table 14 adjusting the metal clips on the corners of his blueprint with the focused precision of someone who had learned that small details, managed correctly at the beginning, prevent larger problems later. Dr. Ito had noticed the blueprint from 40 feet away. Not its content, he could not read it from that distance. He had noticed its format. The layout was non-standard. The margin notation system was one he did not recognize, which meant it had not come from any of the major engineering traditions he knew well, which meant it had been developed independently, which was either a sign of ignorance or a sign of something considerably more interesting. In his experience, those two possibilities were usually distinguishable within the first 30 seconds of closer examination. He had watched from the corner table for 11 minutes without approaching. He had watched Marcus explain the blueprint to 3 different people with the patient economy of someone who had explained it many times and had learned which parts required more time and which parts people reached for intuitively. He had watched the woman from Callaway University ask a follow-up question and observed the specific quality of Marcus's answer. Not simplified, not performed, but calibrated, adjusted in real time to the exact level of technical detail the question suggested she could use. That calibration was not a skill that could be taught in a standard way. It came from a long, private relationship with a problem. He had watched Diana Voss arrive at table 14. He had watched the 8-second assessment. He had watched the blueprint returned with 2 fingers. He had heard the 2 words. He had watched Marcus roll the blueprint back into the tube without a change in expression or pace. He had set down his journal article. He had stood up. He crossed the floor without urgency. People moved aside for him in the unconscious way people move aside for someone who is going somewhere specific with complete confidence in their direction. He reached Marcus 4 steps from the exit. He said simply, "Unroll it again, please." Marcus looked at him for 1 full second. The look was not suspicious and not hopeful. It was the look of someone who had learned to take new information at face value before assigning it meaning. He set the tube on the nearest empty table surface, table 13 unoccupied, and opened it and unrolled the blueprint and replaced the 4 metal clips. Dr. Ito stood across the table from him and read. He read the way engineers read, not linearly, not from top left to bottom right, but in a sequence determined by the architecture of the document itself, moving to the sections that would confirm or deny the most important questions first. He went to the load distribution diagram in the lower left corner first. He studied it for 90 seconds. Then he went to the secondary compression model in the upper right. He studied it for 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Then he went to the materials notation along the left margin, the shorthand Marcus had developed across 4 years of private iteration, and he read it slowly, translating as he went, and the translation was clearly not immediate, which meant the system was genuinely original rather than borrowed from a known notation framework. The room, which had resumed its ambient noise after Diana Voss moved on, had quieted again. Not dramatically, but the particular quiet of people who are pretending less to be doing something else than they had been a moment ago. Dr. Ito looked up from the left margin. He looked at Marcus. He said, "The thermal exchange coefficient in the 3rd stage design, how did you arrive at that value?" Marcus answered in 4 sentences. The first sentence identified the base calculation. The second sentence described the iterative testing process that had refined it across 8 months. The third sentence named the specific failure mode he had been designing against. The fourth sentence gave the final value and the margin of tolerance he had established for it. Dr. Ito was quiet for 3 seconds after the fourth sentence. Not processing quiet. Decided quiet. The quiet of someone who has reached the end of the question they needed to ask and found the answer sufficient. He did not ask another question. He reached into his jacket pocket, removed his phone, and stepped 6 feet to the left of the table. The call connected in 2 rings. He spoke for 3 minutes and 20 seconds. His voice was low enough that the words were not audible from the table, but his posture was not the posture of someone managing a routine call. It was the posture of someone delivering information they consider significant to someone they consider worth delivering it to. He returned to the table. He looked at Marcus. He said, "May I photograph this?" Diana Voss was 30 feet away, at table 17, and she did not hear the question. But Paul Garrett, who had drifted back toward table 14 with the instinct of someone who had learned that returning to a dismissed thing occasionally produced useful information, heard it clearly. He stood very still for a moment. Then he took out his own phone and sent a message to Diana's assistant marked urgent. Marcus said, "Yes." Dr. Ito photographed every section of the blueprint in sequence carefully without rushing. When he finished, he capped his phone, looked at the blueprint one more time, and then looked at Marcus with the specific expression of someone who has just confirmed something they had suspected from a distance and found the confirmation more significant than the suspicion had prepared them for. He said nothing further. He returned to his corner table, sat down, and began typing. The woman from Callaway University, who had remained at the edge of table 14 through all of it, looked at Marcus. She said quietly, "What does it do?" Marcus looked at the blueprint. He said, "It changes how heat moves through a system." She waited. He said, "Everything that runs hot loses energy at the conversion points. This eliminates most of that loss." She looked at the blueprint again. She said, "How long did it take you?" He said, 4 years. She nodded once, slowly, in the way people nod when the answer to a question has explained something they had not known they were wondering about. The morning had started at 5:47, not because Marcus had set an alarm for 5:47. He had set it for 6:15, the same time he set it every weekday, calculated backward from Ava's school start time of 8:30. Accounting for the 22 minutes it took her to eat breakfast when she was not distracted and the 34 minutes it took when she was, and the 14-minute walk to Delmore Elementary, and the 8 minutes Marcus needed after drop-off to reach the train that would get him to the Callaway building with enough time to find table 14 and set up before the floor opened. He had done the calculation on a Tuesday evening with a pencil and a notepad, the way his father had taught him to do calculations that mattered, on paper first, where errors were visible, before trusting them to anything that could not show its work. He had woken at 5:47 because Ava had come into his room at 5:47 and stood at the side of the bed and said his name once, quietly, in the specific register she used when she was not sure whether he was fully asleep or only mostly asleep and did not want to disturb him if it was the former. He had been mostly asleep. He had opened his eyes. She was standing in her pajamas, the ones with the small yellow stars that she had chosen herself from a catalog 6 months ago, and that were now slightly too short in the leg, but which she continued to wear because she had decided they were her favorites, and favorites did not stop being favorites because of minor changes in fit. She was holding Pepper, the stuffed rabbit that had lost one eye to an incident involving the apartment's heating vent 2 years ago, and had been repaired by Marcus with a button from a spare shirt that did not match the original eye precisely, but which Ava had accepted as an improvement because, she had explained with complete seriousness, it gave Pepper character. Under her other arm she was carrying the cardboard tube. She had found it in the hallway, she said. She had recognized it. She wanted to see what was inside. Marcus had sat up. He had looked at the tube for a moment the way he always looked at it. Not with the pride of someone who had made something, but with the particular attention of someone who understood that what they had made was not entirely theirs. He had gotten out of bed, taken the tube from her carefully, and carried it to the living room. He had cleared the coffee table with one hand, moving the library books and the half-finished jigsaw puzzle of a map of the world that they had been working on for 3 weeks, the Atlantic Ocean mostly complete and the Pacific entirely unstarted. He had unrolled the blueprint on the coffee table and weighted the corners with the 4 metal clips and then sat on the floor across from Ava, who had settled cross-legged on the other side of the table with Pepper in her lap and her chin slightly forward, which was the posture she assumed when she was preparing to look at something seriously. She studied it for a long time without speaking. This was not unusual. Ava had inherited from Claire the capacity to be genuinely quiet in the presence of something that required attention, rather than filling the silence with words that were not yet ready. Marcus watched her look at the blueprint and did not explain it. She had not asked him to explain it. She was looking at it the way she looked at things she was deciding what to think about, which was a process she preferred to conduct without assistance. After 4 minutes and some seconds she pointed to the load distribution diagram in the lower left corner. The lines that were densest, the notation most compressed, the revision marks most layered. It was the section that had taken the longest and cost the most and changed the most times before it settled into the form it currently held. She pointed to it and said, "This part is different from the rest." Marcus said, "Yes." She said, "It looks like you fixed something there." He said, "I did." She thought about this. She repositioned Pepper in her lap. She said, "Did Mom draw this part?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She drew the idea of it. I drew what she meant." Ava looked at the diagram for another long moment. Then she looked up at Marcus with the direct, uncomplicated attention that she brought to questions she considered important. She said, "Do you think the people today will understand it?" Marcus said, "I don't know." This answer did not appear to concern her the way it might have concerned an adult. She received it as information rather than as a problem, the way she received most honest answers. Not as something to be anxious about, but as something to be thought about and then set down. She looked at the blueprint one more time. She smoothed the edge of it with 2 fingers, gently, in a gesture so similar to something Claire had done with documents she cared about that Marcus had to look briefly at the window. Then she said, "Mom always said the things worth building don't explain themselves." She said it the way children say things that have settled into them from repetition, not performing the memory of the person who first said it, but simply reporting it as a fact about the world that she had found reliable and was offering because it seemed relevant. She was 7 years old. She did not know what the blueprint contained. She did not know what a modular thermal compression system was, or what its applications were, or what it might be worth in a room full of people who understood those things. She knew that her father had worked on it for as long as she could reliably remember. She knew that it had something to do with her mother. She knew that he was nervous in the specific way he was nervous about things that mattered to him. Not visibly, not in any way that most people would identify as nervousness, but in the way he had made her breakfast that morning with more precision than usual, measuring the orange juice instead of estimating it, which was what he did when part of his attention was already somewhere else. Marcus looked at his daughter across the coffee table. He looked at her for long enough that she tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was checking whether he was all right. He was all right. He was something more complicated than all right, and it did not have a single name, and he was not going to try to give it one at 6 in the morning with the blueprint between them on the coffee table and the Atlantic Ocean mostly finished on the floor beside it. He said, "Help me roll it up." She set Pepper carefully on the couch and came around the table and helped him roll the blueprint from right to left, her small hands following his, learning the pressure without being taught it. He capped the tube. He stood. She went to get her school uniform. He stood in the living room for a moment with the tube in his hands in the early morning quiet of the apartment. The city beginning its noise outside the window, Ava's footsteps moving down the hallway, the jigsaw puzzle on the floor missing most of the Pacific. He had not known, in that moment, that she had tucked the drawing into the tube. She had done it while he was in the kitchen finishing his coffee, a crayon drawing she had made the previous evening of the blueprint as she understood it. 2 figures standing beside a large shape, one tall and one small, a sun in the upper right corner, the whole thing rendered in blue and red crayon with the particular confident inaccuracy of a child who is drawing something important and knows that getting it exactly right matters less than getting it honestly. She had folded it once and slipped it into the tube between the rolled blueprint and the cardboard wall and replaced the cap and left the tube exactly where she had found it. He had not discovered it until the bid hit $50 million, and he reached into his jacket pocket for something to hold on to, and his fingers found the edge of folded paper inside the tube he had been carrying all day, and he had opened it there in the main hall of the Callaway building with the numbers changing on the board behind him and 3 of the most powerful technology executives on the eastern seaboard competing over something he had built in a garage. And he had looked at the drawing and stood very still, and the thing he felt in that moment did not have a name either, but it was large and it was quiet and it was entirely his. The message that reached Paul Garrett's phone at 10:34 was 4 words. "Call me, James Ito." Paul Garrett had not expected to know who James Ito was. He was Diana Voss's lead engineer, not her intelligence service, and the names of chief technical architects at competing firms were not the kind of information that circulated in his professional orbit with any regularity. But he knew who James Ito was because 8 months ago he had been in a conference room when Diana had received a report about Meridian Systems' technical roadmap, and Ito's name had appeared in that report 7 times, each time preceded by language that suggested his assessments were the ones that determined whether Meridian pursued or abandoned a given direction. Diana had read those 7 references with more attention than she gave most documents. She had said nothing afterward. She had not needed to. Paul had forwarded the message to Diana at 10:35 with a single line of his own beneath it. Ito photographed the blueprint from table 14. Diana had been in a conversation with the summit's organizing director when the message arrived. She had excused herself, read the message, and stood in the corridor outside the main hall for 47 seconds, which was 47 seconds longer than she typically spent standing still in the middle of a working day. Then she had called her engineering team. She had 3 engineers she trusted for rapid technical assessment, people she could call with a photograph and a question and receive a considered answer within a time frame that was useful rather than thorough. She had sent the photograph that Paul had taken of the blueprint from table 14 at 10:18, before Ito had made his call, because Paul's instinct, regardless of Diana's verdict, had been that the blueprint warranted documentation. She had sent it with a single instruction. "Tell me what this is." The response came back at 11:02. It was 3 words. "We missed it." Below those 3 words was a technical summary, 9 sentences, written with the compressed precision of people who understood that the person reading it did not need the reasoning explained, only the conclusion confirmed and the implications named. The implications named occupied sentences 4 through 9. Diana read the summary twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and walked back into the main hall and found Paul Garrett and said, quietly, without any of the register she might have used in a different circumstance, "Find out what Meridian offered him." Paul said, "There hasn't been a formal offer yet." Diana said, "There will be within the hour." She was right by 38 minutes. At 12:47, Dr. James Ito approached Marcus Cole in the summit's east corridor, where Marcus had been sitting on a bench eating a sandwich he had brought from home, 2 slices of whole wheat bread, turkey, mustard, no lettuce because Ava had used the last of it for her own lunch, and had a conversation that lasted 22 minutes. Marcus had not taken notes. He had not needed to. The terms Dr. Ito described were specific enough to be remembered and significant enough to command the kind of attention that does not require external recording. When the conversation ended, Marcus had sat on the bench for 4 minutes and then called Dara Osei, who answered on the second ring and said, "You were right about the application." Dara had said, "I know." Marcus had said, "I need a lawyer." Dara had said, "I am a lawyer." Marcus had said, "A current one." Dara had laughed, which was the first time Marcus had heard anyone laugh in a way that felt uncomplicated all day. Atlas Corporation's representative, whose name was Vincent Chow and who had received the forwarded blueprint photographs from 3 separate sources by noon, Dr. Ito's office, a contact inside Voss Technologies, and an analyst at his own firm who had seen Paul Garrett photographing table 14 and drawn an accurate conclusion, had requested a meeting with Marcus through the summit's administrative desk at 1:15. The administrative desk had informed him that the presenter at table 14 had not listed contact information in the summit directory. Vincent Chow had located him anyway, through a process that involved 4 phone calls and 1 conversation with the woman from Callaway University, who had remained in Marcus's orbit through the morning with the focused persistence of someone who had decided this particular situation was worth staying close to. NextGen CEO, Raymond Park, had not attended the summit in person. He had sent a deputy, a 34-year-old named Sarah Lim, who had the particular competence of someone who had been underestimated for long enough to have made it into an advantage. Sarah had been in the building since 8 in the morning. She had reached table 14 at 9:52, 5 minutes after Diana Voss's departure, and had photographed the blueprint with the same efficiency and less visibility than Paul Garrett. She had sent the photographs to Raymond Park at 10:01. Park had responded at 10:09 with 2 words: "Pursue it." By 1:30 she had a figure authorized and a legal framework drafted. The summit's main hall had not been designed for what it became at 2:14 in the afternoon. It had been designed for presentations and panels and the kind of structured professional exchange that proceeds on an agenda and concludes at the scheduled time. What it became instead was the site of something that the summit's organizing director would describe afterward, in an email to the board, as an impromptu acquisition event, which was the most accurate and least adequate description available. It began when Dr. Ito made a verbal offer in the room. This was not standard practice. Acquisition offers were made in private, through legal channels, after preliminary agreements on process and confidentiality. Dr. Ito was aware of this. He had made verbal offers in rooms before, twice, in circumstances where he had determined that the standard process would take longer than the situation allowed. He had determined that now. He spoke clearly, at a volume that was not loud but was sufficient, and named a figure, and the figure landed in the room with the specific weight of a number that is both larger than expected and obviously correct. Vincent Chow responded before the silence had fully formed. His counter was $4 million higher and delivered with the particular composure of someone who had been authorized to go significantly further and was establishing the floor rather than the ceiling. Sarah Lim, who had been standing 12 feet from Marcus and had been watching him rather than the room for the previous 6 minutes, entered a number that was $9 million above Vincent Chow's counter and added, quietly, that NextGen's offer included a provision that Marcus had not heard from the other two, co-development rights, which meant the blueprint remained partially his rather than transferring entirely. She said it quietly enough that only Marcus and the 3 nearest people heard it. It was the most important thing said in the room all afternoon. The board at the front of the hall, which had been displaying the afternoon panel schedule, now displayed 3 columns of numbers that updated in real time as the figures were entered into the summit's administrative system by a staff member who had been asked to document the proceedings and was doing so with the focused intensity of someone who understood they were recording something they would describe for the rest of their career. Diana Voss entered the room from the north corridor at 2:31. She had not been present for the opening exchange. She had heard about it from Paul Garrett by phone 4 minutes after it began, and had covered the distance from the hospitality suite to the main hall in a time that suggested she had not used the elevator. She assessed the board. She assessed the 3 representatives. She assessed Marcus, who was standing at the edge of the room in his work jacket with the paint stain on the left sleeve, holding the crayon drawing, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has arrived at a moment he prepared for without knowing he was preparing for it. She entered a figure. It was $3 million above Sarah Lim's last number. It did not include co-development rights. The number on the board changed 3 times in the following 40 seconds. Marcus did not look at the board. He looked at the drawing in his hand, the 2 figures beside the large shape, the sun in the upper right corner, the blue and red crayon rendered with honest inaccuracy, and he thought about a Tuesday evening and a takeout menu and a woman who thought in shapes before she thought in numbers, and he thought about a garage that smelled like machine oil and cold coffee, and he thought about a 5-year-old being told on a Sunday afternoon that her mother was not coming home, and what it had cost to take all of that and make it into something that could stand on a table in a room and be read by people who understood what it was worth. The final number was $80 million. The corridor outside the main hall was empty. Marcus had not planned to leave immediately after the number settled. He had not planned anything past the moment of arriving at table 14 and unrolling the blueprint and setting the 4 metal clips and waiting to see what happened. Everything after that had been outside the frame of what he had allowed himself to imagine, not from pessimism, but from a habit of attention that his father had modeled and Claire had refined in him further, the discipline of not investing in outcomes before they existed, because outcomes that exist in the mind before they exist in the world accumulate a weight that makes the actual outcome, whatever it is, harder to receive accurately. He had spent 4 years practicing that discipline in the garage. He had gotten reasonably good at it. What he had not gotten good at, and suspected he never would, was the moment after. The moment when the outcome arrived and the discipline was no longer needed and there was nothing between him and what had actually happened. He needed a corridor. The corridor outside the main hall ran east to west, 60 feet, with a window at the far end that looked out over the city's eastern district, the older buildings giving way to the newer ones in a progression that had always interested Marcus architecturally. Not because of the newer buildings, which were competent and similar, but because of the older ones, which had been built by people who did not know what would be built beside them and had designed accordingly, with a completeness and a confidence that did not require the future's approval. He stood at the window. The city was doing what it always did. Indifferent and continuous and entirely unaware that anything had changed. He opened the tube. He had not opened it since unrolling the blueprint on table 13 for Dr. Ito. He reached in beside the rolled blueprint and found the edge of the folded paper with his fingers and drew it out carefully and unfolded it on his palm. The crayon drawing was exactly as Ava had made it, the 2 figures beside the large shape, the sun in the upper right corner, the blue lines and the red lines intersecting in the lower section in a pattern that bore no technical relationship to the actual blueprint but captured, in the way that children's drawings sometimes capture things that more precise renderings miss, something true about what the blueprint was attempting to do. It was attempting to solve a problem that had a human cost. It was attempting to take something that had been lost and make it into something that could be used. The drawing understood this without being able to say it. The the way Ava understood most things, completely in a register that preceded language. Marcus folded it again along its original crease and held it. Behind him he heard the corridor door. He did not turn around. He knew the sound of Diana Voss moving through a space by now, not from familiarity in the ordinary sense, but in the way you learn the specific signature of a person whose presence has restructured the atmosphere of every room you have shared with them across a day that has been longer and more consequential than most. She did not move loudly. She moved with the particular intention of someone who had decided to do something and was completing the motion without second-guessing it, which was, he had observed how she did most things. It was also, he recognized with the specific recognition that comes from watching someone closely in extreme circumstances, how Claire had moved. Not the same, nothing was the same, but in the same category of commitment. The kind of movement that does not leave room for retreat to be confused with reconsideration. She stopped beside him. Not close in any way that required acknowledgement. Close in the way that two people stand when they have been through something together from opposite sides and have arrived, without planning it, at the same window. She did not speak immediately. He did not turn. They both looked at the city, which continued without them. After a moment she said, "How long?" It was not inflected as a question exactly. It was inflected as a request for information that she understood she had not earned in the normal way and was asking for anyway, plainly, without the architecture of professional courtesy that had surrounded everything she had said earlier in the day. He said, 4 years. She was quiet. In the main hall behind them the sound of the administrative process was audible. Voices, a phone, the particular acoustic texture of a large room being reorganized after something unexpected. Out here there was none of that. Out here there was the city light against the glass and the low continuous sound of the building's ventilation system and the specific silence of two people who have not decided yet what to do with each other. She said, "I looked at it for 8 seconds. He said nothing. She said, "I had decided before I looked." He said, "I know." She turned to look at him then because the answer required it, not defensively but because I know, said the way he said it, without accusation and without absolution, was the kind of answer that required the speaker to be looked at directly. She looked at him. He was still facing the window. His profile was the profile of someone who had finished being angry about something a long time ago, not because the thing had been resolved, but because anger had proven less useful than the thing it was protecting and he had found something more useful to put in its place. She recognized the look. She had seen it once before, in a man who had spent 3 years rebuilding a company after a partnership dissolved and had come out the other side with a quietness that everyone around him mistook for detachment and that she had understood, from the first time she met him, was the opposite of detachment. It was the deepest form of investment, the kind that had stopped needing to announce itself. She looked at the drawing in his hand. He had not put it away. It was folded along its original crease, and he was holding it with the particular care of someone holding something that is not fragile in any material sense, but that they have decided to treat as though it were. She said, "What is that?" He said, "My daughter drew it." She said, "Of the blueprint?" He said, "Of what she thought it looked like." A pause. She looked at the folded drawing. He did not unfold it. She did not ask him to. The city pushed its early evening light against the glass in long low angles that made the corridor feel both smaller and less temporary than it had 10 minutes ago. She said, "How old is she?" He said, 7. She said, "What is her name?" He said, "Ava." The name sat in the corridor for a moment. She did not repeat it. She received it in the way she had received several things across the day that had turned out to be more significant than their surface suggested. Quietly, without immediately deciding what to do with it, which was not how she usually received information and which she was aware of as she did it. She said, "Does she know what today was?" He thought about this. He thought about the coffee table and the blueprint and the Pacific Ocean unfinished on the floor and the star pajamas that were slightly too short in the leg. He thought about small hands helping to roll the blueprint from right to left. He thought about a crayon drawing slipped into a tube without telling him. He said, "She knew it mattered." Diana Voss looked at the window. The city ran its usual frequencies below, the low percussion of traffic, the distant compression of a siren, the anonymous continuous noise of a place that does not pause for the things that happen inside it. She had spent 20 years in that noise. She had built something significant inside it and she had protected it, and she had learned in the process of protecting it to assess everything quickly and decide everything faster and trust the assessment more than the thing it assessed. It had worked. It had worked in the specific way that effective strategies work, reliably and at a cost that you calculate afterward, in corridors like this one, standing at windows like this one, next to people who remind you by their simple presence of the calculation you have not yet completed. She did not say anything further. He did not say anything further. The corridor held them both without requiring anything from either of them, which was something corridors could do that rooms full of people and numbers on boards and formal processes could not. After a while, he refolded the drawing along its crease and placed it back in the tube beside the blueprint and capped the tube and held it at his side. She watched him do this from the corner of her vision without appearing to watch. The gesture was so ordinary. A man putting a piece of paper away, and so entirely not ordinary in everything it contained that she found she could not immediately look away from it, even after it was complete. He said, "I need to call my daughter." She said, "Yes." He turned from the window. She remained facing it. He walked toward the corridor door and she listened to his footsteps on the floor without turning around, and when the door opened and the sound of the main hall came briefly in and then was cut off again as the door closed, she stayed at the window for another 3 minutes and 40 seconds, looking at the city that was doing what it always did, and thinking about something she had decided in 8 seconds and what it had almost cost, and what the 4 years on the other side of that decision had looked like from inside a garage that smelled like machine oil and cold coffee, and what it meant that a 7-year-old girl had drawn a picture of something she did not fully understand and tucked it into a tube without being asked and trusted that it would find its way to the right moment. It had. She put her hand in her jacket pocket. She found the edge of a business card she had been carrying for 3 weeks without giving to anyone, which was unusual for her, since the card served no purpose in a pocket and she did not carry things that served no purpose. She held it between 2 fingers for a moment. Then she left it where it was and turned from the window and walked back toward the main hall, and the corridor was empty behind her, and the city continued below, and somewhere 14 blocks north a 7-year-old girl was at a kitchen table finishing her homework and waiting for her father to call.